Welcome to our literary journey. Hello, dear lovers of beautiful stories. Today I will share with you a narrative that touches the deepest fibers of the human soul. A story about freedom, love, and redemption, set in Brazil of 1887, when the winds of abolition were already whispering through the interior haciendas. Prepare your hearts to meet Rosario, a young woman who found strength in fragility, hope in despair, and love where she least expected it. This is a journey about how two wounded hearts can heal each other, transforming silences into music and solitude into family. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from? I love to know what corners of Brazil and the world our literature reaches. If you appreciate narratives that touch the soul, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave that like to strengthen our community of passionate readers. Year: 1887. Place: interior of Brazil. Hacienda of Silence, 3 leagues from the village of Santa Rita do Monte, surrounded by mountains that keep secrets and whisper stories to the wind. The Hacienda of Silence. The mountains that surrounded the Hacienda of Silence knew how to keep secrets. Since 1882, when the last childish laughter echoed through the corridors of the big house, the wind carried only melancholic whispers among the abandoned coffee plantations. Manuel Rodrigues de Souza walked through the empty rooms like a ghost of himself, his 42 years weighing on his shoulders like entire decades. The property, once prosperous with its coffee and sugarcane plantations, now breathed the heavy silence of nostalgia. On the walls, faded portraits of Francisca and little João and Isabel seemed to observe him with eyes that no longer shone. The melancholic owner lightly touched the dusty glass of the frames like one who caresses ghosts. Sebastião, the black foreman of 58 years, veteran of the Paraguay War, knew every sigh of his master. His calloused hands cared for the hacienda with the devotion of one who understands the language of silences. Luzia, the 45-year-old cook, prepared meals that Manuel barely touched, seasoned with the maternal patience of one who waits for life to return to the pots. Antonio, the 19-year-old young man, raised by Manuel as a son of the heart, observed everything with the curious eyes of one who senses changes on the horizon. That July afternoon of 1887, while arranging the reins in the stable, he felt something different in the air, a silent expectation, as if the earth itself breathed in rhythm with waiting. Twilight tinged the mountains golden when Manuel sat on the gallery, contemplating the gardens where Francisca used to pick jasmine. The phantom aroma of the flowers seemed to dance in the cold air, mixed with the scent of coffee that had never again been harvested with joy. Suddenly, a strange noise cut through the night silence, hesitant steps on the dirt road, accompanied by panting breath that echoed among the trees. Who would be capable of breaking the sacred silence of the hacienda at that hour? The waning moon barely illuminated the road when the figure emerged from the shadows, a young woman dressed in rags that were once a blue dress, her bare feet bleeding on the cold earth. Rosario Santos da Costa, 23 years of suffering engraved on her angelic face, trembled not only from the night's cold, but from the terror she carried in her brown eyes. Manuel rose from the rocking chair, his heart racing for the first time in 5 years. Sebastião emerged from the shadow of the porch, his hand instinctively seeking the handle of the knife he always carried since the war. But something in the fragility of that apparition disarmed any impulse of defense. "Help!" was the only word that sprang from Rosario's lips before her knees touched the earth. Lucia ran from the kitchen upon hearing the commotion, her maternal arms already opening before understanding the situation. The young fugitive was wrapped in the warmth of a wool shawl that smelled of cinnamon and rosemary, while gentle hands guided her inside the house that had not received visitors for so long. In the guest room, under the yellowish light of the oil lamp, Rosario told her story in fragments broken by tears. The São Bento Hacienda, Colonel Bento Xavier Moreira, the 15 years of captivity that began when she was just an 8-year-old girl. The party in the big house, the moment of distraction, the escape through the closed forest for 3 days and 2 nights. The words came out like painful confessions, each one carrying the weight of humiliations that no human being should endure. Manuel listened in silence, his fists clenched, not with anger, but with a deep understanding that only broken hearts know how to recognize. Lucia prepared a warm bath with mint leaves, while Sebastião mounted discreet guard on the gallery. Antonio, moved by compassion that transcended his tender age, brought clean clothes that had belonged to Francisca, a simple white cotton dress that seemed to restore some dignity to that wounded soul. When Rosario finally fell asleep, Manuel remained awake in the parlor, contemplating the flames of the fireplace and feeling something awaken in his chest, not love yet, but the recognition of a pain akin to his own. What secrets would that unexpected arrival bring to the sleeping hacienda? The weeks that followed imperceptibly transformed the rhythm of the hacienda of silence. Rosario, recovering under Lucia's devoted care, began to walk through the corridors with still cautious steps, like a wounded bird testing its healed wings. It was in Francisca's abandoned garden that she found her first true refuge. Among the wild rose bushes and flower beds invaded by weeds, her delicate hands began a silent work of resurrection. Each movement was a mute prayer, each rescued flower a small act of faith in the possibility of rebirth. Manuel observed from afar, through the window of his study, that fragile figure returning life to what seemed irredeemably dead. There was something sacred in that patient work, an ancestral dance between woman and earth that awakened dormant memories in his soul. One morning he approached the flower beds, where Rosario was transplanting jasmine plants. The perfume of the newly planted flowers mixed with the smell of moist earth, creating an olfactory symphony that transported him to happier times. "She liked jasmine," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. Rosario raised her eyes, finding in that mature man the same melancholy she carried in her own heart. They needed no words to understand that they spoke of similar losses, of loves interrupted by destiny's cruelty. "Flowers know how to wait," she replied, her hands delicately caressing the petals. "Even when we believe they have already died, they keep life in their roots." It was that afternoon when Manuel told about Francisca and the children, not about curses or mysteries, but about the deep melancholy that devoured his wife after Isabel's birth, about the yellow fever epidemic that swept the region in 1882, taking first Joan and then little Isabel, while Francisca languished with sadness until she could fight no more. Rosario listened with an open heart, understanding that there were no ghosts there, only nostalgias that needed to be honored without becoming prisons. When he finished speaking, she extended one of her earth-stained hands and lightly touched his. That simple touch without pretensions carried more intimacy than 1,000 declarations. It was the first thread of an invisible web that began to weave between two hearts in the process of healing. How would that encounter of wounded souls transform into something greater? October arrived with cool mornings and golden afternoons, painting the coffee plantation leaves with tones of honey and rust. Rosario had become a natural part of the hacienda's routine. Her days divided between the resurrected garden and long evening conversations with Manuel on the gallery. They spoke of everything and nothing, about the changes that the winds of abolition brought, about books she had learned to read in stolen hours of childhood, about dreams that both had kept in locked drawers of the heart. Each word was a step climbed toward mutual trust that flourished like the plants of the renewed garden. One afternoon, Lucia found Rosario in the sewing room, bent over an old patchwork quilt that had belonged to Francisca. Her skillful fingers repaired the holes left by time, carefully choosing new fabrics that would harmonize with the old ones. "I'm not trying to erase anything," she explained, when Lucia questioned her delicately. "I just want the good memories to continue giving warmth." The cook smiled with tears in her eyes, recognizing in that young woman the mature wisdom of one who had learned to distinguish between honoring the past and being its prisoner. It was in that same week that Manuel made a decision that had been maturing in his chest like fruit on the tree. During a walk along the path that led to the stream, where the araucarias whispered secrets to the wind, he stopped beside a smooth stone covered with moss. "Rosario," he said, his voice trembling with a vulnerability he hadn't felt in years, "I know you still carry wounds, as do I. I know you need time to trust completely. But I would like you to consider the possibility of us being together, truly, as husband and wife." She looked at him with eyes bright with unshed tears, her heart accelerated by the recognition that those months of coexistence had planted seeds that now sprouted like a declaration of love. "Abolition is near," he continued. "You are already free here. You always have been since you arrived. But I want to offer more than refuge. I want to offer a true home, if you accept." Rosario touched her chest, where her heart beat like a festival drum. For the first time since childhood, she felt truly free to choose her own destiny. "Yes," she whispered, the word flying across the fields like a promise of spring. But what shadows from the past still threatened their newly born happiness? The wedding preparations took place amid a discreet joy that seemed to bless every corner of the hacienda. Sebastião carved wooden flowers to decorate the small chapel, while Antonio polished the benches with the care of one preparing his own home. Lucia embroidered the wedding dress with silver thread, each stitch loaded with whispered blessings. Rosario, radiant in her silent happiness, began to divide her time between the final arrangements and long afternoons in the garden, where she had planted white roses, especially to ornament the altar. The perfume of the flowers mixed with the smell of corn cake that Lucia was testing in the kitchen, creating an atmosphere of intimate and cozy celebration. It was the eve of the wedding when happiness was wounded by an unexpected shadow. Rosario was picking jasmine for the bouquet when she spotted a familiar figure emerging from the path that led to the main road. Benedito, Colonel Bento Xavier's henchman, walked with characteristic arrogance, his small, cruel eyes surveying the property like a predator scenting prey. Rosario's heart raced, the flowers falling from her trembling hands, while painful memories flooded her mind. Benedito had found her during one of her previous escape attempts 3 years ago, and the violence that followed still left invisible scars on her soul. "So this is where the little fugitive black girl is hiding," he said, approaching with malevolent smile. "The colonel is very worried about you, girl. Very worried indeed." Sebastião appeared like a protective shadow beside Rosario, his hand firm on the knife handle, the veteran's eyes evaluating the enemy. Manuel emerged from the house, alerted by the instinct he had learned to trust after years of vigilant solitude. "This property is private," Manuel said, his voice controlled but charged with authority. "You have no business here, sir." Benedito spat on the ground, a despicable gesture that revealed his coarse nature. "Yes, I do. I came to fetch my master's property. She ran away, but now she's going back, whether she wants to or not." The tension thickened like morning mist, enveloping everyone in an atmosphere of imminent danger. Rosario felt her strength failing, but something within her, perhaps the newly discovered love, perhaps the proximity of legal freedom, made her find courage she thought lost. "I'm not going back," she declared, her clear voice cutting through the heavy air. Never again. What threats would Benedito bring to that refuge of conquered peace? The dawn of the wedding day arrived laden with dense clouds that darkened the sky like an omen. Benedito had departed the previous night, but not without first launching threats that echoed through the hacienda's corridors like distant storm echoes. Rosario awoke with a heavy heart, the previous day's joy contaminated by the certainty that her happiness would be tested before being declared. Lucia found her sitting by the room's window, contemplating the mountains that now seemed more protective than ever. "I cannot marry knowing I bring danger to Manuel," she murmured, silent tears sliding down her cheeks. The cook sat beside her, enveloping her in a maternal embrace that smelled of cinnamon and courage. "Child, true love doesn't flee from dangers. It faces them hand in hand." Those words gave Rosario strength to put on the embroidered dress, to let Lucia arrange her hair with jasmine flowers, to walk to the chapel where Manuel waited beside Father Ignacio, who had come especially from the village to bless the union. The ceremony was taking place in an atmosphere of sacred intimacy when the sound of horses interrupted the priest's words. Colonel Bento Xavier Moreira appeared at the chapel door, accompanied by 4 armed gunmen, his presence poisoning the air like plague over plantation. "Stop this farce," ordered the colonel, his voice echoing through the stone walls. "Benedito told me about this performance. That black woman is my property and will return with me." Manuel stepped forward, placing himself between his bride and the invader, but it was Rosario who spoke, surprising everyone with the firmness she found in her own heart. "I am no one's property. I never will be again." Father Ignacio raised the cross he wore at his chest, his serene voice cutting through the tension. "Times are changing, Colonel. Abolition is near. God doesn't bless chains, but freedoms." It was then that the greatest surprise was revealed. Inhabitants of Santa Rita do Monte began arriving at the chapel, so José with his 5 sons, Francisco de Valle and his wife, João Pereira, and other simple but determined men. Sebastião had ridden during the dawn, awakening consciences and summoning just hearts for a greater cause. Surrounded and outnumbered, the colonel understood that he faced more than an escape. He faced a change of era. How would that confrontation define not only Rosario's destiny, but everyone's future? The tension in the chapel had thickened like heavy rain before falling upon the earth. Colonel Bento Xavier looked around, counting the men who had come to defend not only Rosario, but the very human dignity he insisted on denying. Father Ignazio advanced a few steps, his cassock fluttering with an authority that came from deep convictions, not from weapons or intimidation. "Colonel, you can choose between being part of the change that has already begun or being run over by it. Abolition will come, whether you want it or not. You can receive it with dignity or kick like a contrary child." The priest's words echoed through the stone walls, while the colonel's gunmen began to show signs of hesitation. They were simple men, not monsters, and the presence of so many respectable neighbors made them question the justice of their mission. It was then that Rosario took the bravest step of her life. She approached the colonel, her firm eyes meeting his without the submission he expected to find. "For 15 years you broke me into pieces," she said, her clear voice resonating through the silent chapel. "But the pieces became seeds, and seeds always find strength to sprout, even in the hardest earth." The colonel stepped back, as if he had been physically struck. In those brown eyes that once shone only with tears of fear, he now saw a light that astonished him. "There's one more thing you need to know," continued Rosario, her hand instinctively touching her still flat belly. "I'm expecting a child. Your child will never know chains." The revelation fell upon everyone like lightning in a clear sky. Manuel felt his heart explode with joy and tenderness, while Lucia whispered a prayer of gratitude. The men who had come to defend her raised their hats in sign of respect, and even the gunmen lowered their weapons, touched by the sacredness of that moment. The colonel understood that he had lost more than a slave. He had lost an entire era. Without uttering a word, he signaled for his men to retreat, but before leaving he murmured something no one expected to hear: "May God protect the child." When the last echoes of the horses' hooves were lost in the distance, Father Ignazio resumed the ceremony, as if it had not been interrupted. Manuel and Rosario exchanged vows that sounded like hymns of freedom, sealed the union with a kiss that tasted of future, and walked hand in hand out of the chapel under a gentle rain that washed the air of all threats. What challenges still awaited that family born between blessings and storms? The months that followed the wedding brought a transformation that surpassed the physical changes of Rosario's pregnancy. The Hacienda of Silence, now rechristened as New Hope Hacienda, awakened from its long melancholic sleep, like a person returning to life after serious illness. Rosario's garden bloomed exuberantly, its vibrant colors spreading through flower beds that multiplied like natural extension of her joy. Manuel resumed care of the coffee plantations with renewed vigor. Sebastião organized the sugarcane harvest with his usual efficiency, and Antonio assumed growing responsibilities, maturing under the proud eyes of the master who had raised him. Lucia embroidered diapers and little blankets with maternal dedication, while Sebastião carved a cradle from hardwood that would be his personal masterpiece. The entire house breathed sweet expectation, seasoned with the aroma of delicacies the cook prepared to satisfy the peculiar desires of the expectant mother. Rosario, 6 months pregnant, radiated a luminous serenity that had transformed every environment through which she passed. Her hands constantly caressed her rounded belly, conversing with the child in affectionate whispers that Manuel listened to secretly, his heart overflowing with tenderness. November nights were dedicated to plans whispered in the intimacy of the couple's room. They dreamed of the child's name, of the future they would build together, of the school they intended to establish on the hacienda to teach the region's children to read and write. "Our child will be born free," murmured Rosario, her head resting on Manuel's shoulder. "Truly free, not just by the law that will come, but free in the heart." One afternoon, while they rested on the gallery, watching Antonio teach new tricks to the hacienda's dogs, the news they were waiting for arrived. The abolition of slavery had been signed by Princess Isabel. May 1888 brought winds of freedom that blew throughout Brazil, but at New Hope Hacienda, the celebration was silent and deep, like gratitude whispered in prayer. Sebastião removed his hat and stood still for long minutes, his tearful eyes turned toward the sky. Lucia prepared a special banquet, and even some neighbors came to celebrate discreetly, recognizing that this hacienda had been a precursor to a change that now spread throughout the nation. But amid the general joy, Rosario felt an uneasiness she couldn't name. There was something in the air, a subtle tension that only very sensitive hearts know how to perceive. What shadows still hovered over that happiness that seemed finally consolidated? December brought scattered rains and humid heat that made the flowers in Rosario's garden bloom in profusion. The entire house vibrated with the proximity of birth, Lucia had prepared everything for delivery. Sebastião had mounted extra guard around the property, and Manuel could barely hide the anxiety mixed with joy that took hold of his days. It was a night of waning moon when the smell of smoke awakened Sebastião from his light sleep. The war veteran jumped from bed with reflexes trained by experience, running to the window to confirm his worst fears. The stable was in flames, the tongues of fire licking the dark sky like demonic tongues. The alarm echoed throughout the hacienda. Manuel and Antonio ran to organize the firefighting, while Lucia wrapped Rosario in shawls and led her away from danger. The men formed a human chain between the well and the stable, passing water buckets that seemed insignificant drops before the voraciousness of the flames. It was in the midst of the tumult that Sebastião noticed Rosario's absence. Lucia ran through the house shouting the young mistress's name, but found only the shawl abandoned on the porch. The foreman's heart froze upon understanding that the fire had not been an accident, but distraction for a more sinister plan. Benedito emerged from the shadows near the old abandoned slave quarters, dragging Rosario by her hair while she struggled with the limited strength of one carrying a child. The henchman had returned in silence, feeding a hatred that had grown during the months of humiliation after the failure at the chapel. "Now you come with me," he growled, pushing the young woman inside the stone construction that still held the sour smell of suffering from other times. "And if anyone comes after us, I'll finish you and the child." Rosario fell onto the beaten earth floor, instinctively protecting her belly with her hands. The slave quarters walls seemed to press her soul with foreign memories of pain, but something had changed within her since the wedding. She was no longer the terrified girl who had fled from São Bento Hacienda. "Benedito," she said, her voice surprisingly calm, "you don't need to do this. Slavery ended. You too can choose to be truly free, free from the hatred that's eating your heart." The henchman hesitated for an instant, confused by the serenity of that woman who should be begging for mercy. How would Rosario transform her greatest trial into a moment of unexpected redemption? The hours dragged like eternity inside the humid slave quarters, where Rosario remained seated on a pile of old straw, her hands protecting the child who moved restlessly in her womb. Benedito paced nervously from one side to the other, the weapon swaying in his trembling hands, while he listened to the distant shouts of men fighting the fire. The young woman observed that tormented man with a compassion she herself didn't completely understand. There was something familiar in his desperation, as if she recognized in him the same ghosts that had once haunted her. "You were also a slave, weren't you?" she asked softly. Benedito stopped walking, his small eyes turning toward her with mixed surprise and anger. "Don't speak to me as if you knew me," he growled. "You know nothing about me." "I know you carry pain," continued Rosario, her voice maintaining the maternal tone she had developed over months. "The same pain I carried. The difference is that I chose to let it go." It was at that moment that an unexpected figure appeared at the slave quarters door. Colonel Bento Xavier staggered inside the construction, but he was not the same arrogant man who had invaded the chapel months before. Thin, pale, leaning on an improvised cane, he seemed to have aged decades in a few months. "Drop the weapon, Benedito," ordered the colonel, his voice weak but still authoritative. "Enough. Enough of all this." The henchman turned to his master with an expression of incredulity. "Colonel, did you come to fetch the little black girl?" "I came to ask forgiveness," replied the old landowner, the words costing him visible effort. "I'm dying, Benedito. The doctor from the capital said I have few months, and I cannot die carrying so much weight on my conscience." Rosario felt tears spring to her eyes, not from fear, but from a deep sadness for all the lives wasted in hatred and wounded pride. The colonel approached her slowly, his knees trembling when he knelt on the dirty floor of the slave quarters. "Girl," he said, his voice broken by emotion, I sinned against you in ways that not even God should forgive, but I'm here asking for that forgiveness, knowing I don't deserve it." Rosario extended her hand and delicately touched the wrinkled face of the man who had been her executioner for so many years. "I forgive," she whispered, "not because you deserve it, but because I need to be free, and forgiving is the last chain I can break." Benedito let the weapon fall to the ground, his shoulders shaking with sobs he had kept for decades. Manuel and Sebastião came running, but stopped at the door upon witnessing that scene of redemption that none of them could have imagined. How would that moment transform forever the lives of all present? The dawn of December brought a blessed calm after the previous night's emotional storm. The stable had been saved before the flames consumed more than a third of the structure, and the hacienda's men worked together to repair the damage. Benedito, freed from his invisible bonds by Rosario's forgiveness, had asked to stay and help in the reconstruction as a form of penance. Colonel Bento Xavier had departed at dawn, but not before leaving a legal document formally freeing all the slaves who still remained on his property. Rosario, shaken by the night's events, but strengthened by the sense of peace that forgiveness had brought, began to feel the first contractions still in the early morning. Lucia, experienced in births after decades caring for women in the region, took charge of the situation with the maternal efficiency that characterized her. "It's time, child," she announced, preparing the house to receive new life. "This little one doesn't want to wait even one more day." Manuel was banned from the house during labor, a tradition that Lucia imposed with unshakable authority. He spent the hours walking through the gardens that Rosario had cultivated, talking with Sebastião about the approaching changes and trying to control the anxiety that consumed him. The sun was already high in the sky when the first cry echoed through the open windows of the big house, a strong, healthy cry that announced the arrival of new hope to that land that had learned to heal its wounds. "It's a boy!" shouted Lucia from the window, her face radiant with joy. A perfect boy. Joaquim dos Santos Rodriguez was born on December 15, 1887, weighing 7 pounds, and carrying in his brown eyes the serene brightness of his mother and the determination of his father. When Manuel could finally enter the room and hold his son in his arms, he felt that all the losses of the past found their meaning in that moment. Rosario, pale but radiant, watched husband and son with a smile that illuminated the entire environment. Sebastião and Antonio waited at the door, hats in hand, to meet the little prince who would be raised in complete freedom. "Welcome to New Hope Hacienda, Joaquim," whispered Manuel, his voice choked with emotion. "Here you will learn that freedom is not just not having chains. It's having the courage to love, to forgive, and to dream." The weeks that followed were of sweet adaptation to the new routine. Rosario nursed her son on the sunny gallery, singing songs she invented on the spot, while Manuel observed from afar, marveled by the maternal naturalness of his wife. What lessons would that child bring to a family forged in the fire of adversities? 1888 dawned with golden promises in the coffee plantations of New Hope Hacienda. Joaquim had completed his first month of life when the official news of slavery's abolition arrived, confirming what everyone already knew in their hearts. Times had changed forever. Manuel and Rosario's property became a beacon of hope for the newly freed in the region. Entire families arrived asking for work and housing, and were received with dignity and fair wages. Sebastião had organized small houses around the big house, creating a community that functioned more like an extended family than an employer-employee relationship. Rosario, even while busy with baby care, found time to teach women to read and write under the generous shade of the mango tree in the yard. Her classes were punctuated by children's laughter playing nearby, and Joaquim's babbling, who grew chubby and healthy in the arms of those who loved him. Manuel expanded the plantations, diversifying with corn, beans, and vegetables that guaranteed abundant sustenance for everyone. Evenings were dedicated to family. He and Rosario sat on the gallery after dinner, the child in one or the other's lap, planning the future with the serenity of those who had learned that true happiness dwells in simple details. It was in March that they received an unexpected visit. Benedito returned to the hacienda, but not as the tormented man who had left months before. He wore simple but clean clothes, brought a shy smile on his face, and carried in his hands a rag doll made by his wife for little Joaquim. "I learned a trade in the city," he explained, embarrassed but determined. "I work with wood now. I make furniture, toys. I wanted to know if you would accept me working here too." Rosario, holding the child who now smiled at strangers, looked at Manuel and both understood without words that this request represented much more than seeking employment. It was seeking complete redemption. "There's always room for those who want to start over," replied Manuel, extending his hand in a gesture of welcome. The following months brought gentle but constant changes. Ana was born in 1889, a green-eyed girl who inherited her mother's delicacy and her father's easy smile. Miguel arrived in 1891, completing the offspring that would fill the house with laughter and running. New Hope Hacienda prospered not only financially, but socially. It became a model of harmonious coexistence, where former slaves and landowners' children shared desks in the improvised school, where June festivals brought the entire community together without distinction of color or origin. Rosario, watching her 3 children play in the garden she had cultivated with so much love, felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her there. But what new challenges would the future reserve for that family growing in love and prosperity? The golden years of New Hope Hacienda were interrupted in the autumn of 1895 by an unexpected crisis. A mysterious plague attacked the coffee plantations, devastating the plantation that sustained the entire community. The leaves yellowed for no apparent reason, the fruits fell green, and the property's main source of income evaporated like morning mist. Manuel, now 50 years old, faced the challenge with the determination he had developed throughout years of struggle. He consulted specialists from the capital, experimented with various treatments, but nothing seemed to stop the advance of the disease that consumed his decades of work. Rosario, 31 years old with 3 small children to raise, perceived her husband's growing anguish. Joaquim, at 8 years old, already understood that something serious was happening when he saw his father walking through the dead coffee plantations with an expression of dejection. It was on a sleepless night that Manuel revealed the full extent of the problem. Sitting on the gallery where they had dreamed together so many times, he confessed that financial reserves were being depleted and that they might need to sell part of the property to honor commitments to the workers. "I cannot dismiss anyone," he said, his voice laden with responsibility. "These families depend on us. Some have nowhere to go." Rosario listened in silence, understanding that they faced the greatest test of their married life. It was easy to maintain unity during prosperous times, but true virtues revealed themselves in adversities. "Do you remember when you taught me about plants?" she said gently, "that sometimes they need to be pruned to grow stronger." The next morning, Rosario made a decision that surprised everyone. She sold all the jewelry she had received from Manuel during their years of marriage. Rings, necklaces, earrings she kept as treasures. The money wouldn't solve all problems, but would guarantee a few months' respite to find solutions. Sebastião, now over 60 but still strong, proposed completely diversifying production. Instead of depending only on coffee, they could plant basic foods to sell in the region, raise chickens, goats, make intelligent use of every inch of land. The entire community mobilized. Benedito used his carpentry skills to create ingenious irrigation systems. The women organized a sewing cooperative to generate extra income. The children, including Joaquim, Ana, and Miguel, helped within their capabilities. They were months of hard work, poorly slept nights, simple meals, but they were also months that showed the true strength of bonds built over the years. No one abandoned the hacienda. No one lost faith in the future. How would that supreme test shape the final destiny of the family and community they had created? The spring of 1896 brought the first signs of recovery. The new plantations of corn, beans, and vegetables had prospered beyond expectations, and production diversification proved more stable than the previous dependence on coffee. The women's sewing cooperative had gained fame in the region, and Benedito's furniture was sought after in the village of Santa Rita do Monte. More important than financial recovery was the discovery of a community strength no one knew they possessed. The crisis had united that extended family even more, showing that the true wealth of New Hope Hacienda was not in the land or plantations, but in the bonds of love and solidarity woven over the years. Rosario, contemplating her children playing in the garden resurrected after the economic storm, understood that she had learned life's most important lesson. True love is not just shared joy, but courage to face any adversity together. Joaquim grew to become a just man like his father, studied in the capital and returned to modernize the hacienda's agricultural techniques. Ana inherited her mother's artistic sensitivity and became a teacher, expanding the small school until it became a regional reference. Miguel developed talent for business and took the hacienda's products to distant markets, always maintaining the ethical principles he learned at home. Manuel lived to 80 years old, time enough to see grandchildren running along the same paths where he and Rosario had walked hand in hand for decades of conquered happiness. He died peacefully on a golden autumn afternoon, surrounded by the family he built with patience and love. Rosario lived to 69 years old, dedicating her final years to writing memoirs that became historical documents about the transition from slavery to freedom in the Brazilian interior. Her words, simple but profound, touched hearts throughout the country. When she departed, on a serene spring morning, she left a legacy that transcended the borders of New Hope Hacienda. The property had become a symbol that it's possible to build a society based on respect, dignity, and mutual love. The gardens she planted continued blooming, cared for by following generations. The school that began under the mango tree grew to become a college. The community that formed around the hacienda remained united, passing from parents to children the values that Manuel and Rosario planted like precious seeds. Today, those who visit the region still hear stories about the woman who transformed suffering into wisdom, who taught that forgiving liberates more the one who forgives than the one forgiven, who showed it's possible to build earthly paradises when you plant with love and harvest with gratitude. New Hope Hacienda remains as living testimony that the most beautiful dreams are those built by 4 hands, watered with tears of joy, and protected by the certainty that true love is the most powerful force in the universe. And so, among mountains that keep secrets and winds that carry promises, the story of Rosario and Manuel continues whispering to those who have ears to listen. It's never too late to start over. It's never impossible to forgive. No dream built with love is ever too small.